All right. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on which part of the world you are at. Welcome to our webinar on how to stop your Kubernetes costs from spinning out of control. My name is Kevin Ng. I'm a Senior Solutions Architect at Mirantis, and I will be your host and presenter at the same time today. So without further ado, let's get right into it. Now, a little bit about me. Once again, my name is Kevin Ng. I'm a Senior Solutions Architect at Mirantis in the pre-sales team. And my work is really to help folks uncover issues and guide them to a solution. To today's topic and the reason why you're all here today, everything about the costs, the money, the value that you get from Kubernetes. So what we're going to be covering today is a couple different things. One, the different types of Kubernetes costs, things to consider when you're building your cost monitoring and chargeback policy. And some lessons learned from implementing cost monitoring and chargeback in enterprise deployments. What are some of the capabilities that you would perhaps need, and or solutions to some of the issues what you run into when managing your costs or looking at how to even effectively reduce it. And when we talk about Kubernetes costs, we could break them down into a couple of different categories. I mean, some of them are more obvious, some of them are perhaps less so. But in my mind, we could break them down into kind of four different groups here. One is your infrastructure costs. And this is the most obvious of your costs, right? This will be either your private, public cloud, the actual machine that you're running on. Second is your operational costs, your configuration, running your clusters, running workloads, and so on and so forth. The third group is your opportunity costs. And what we mean by that is, are you allocating your resources to those that is actually providing value to your company, right? Are you losing any revenue because of management or downtime or other operational activities? And then the fourth and final one is your reputational cost. And that really comes with how the end consumer or the exterior customers view the company because of various different activities that may or may not occur from the management of the Kubernetes clusters. And I'll go into that in a bit more detail later on as well. So we'll break down these four types of costs, what I mean by those, and also we'll look at how we can manage some of those as well. So the first of costs, your infrastructure costs. Like you mentioned earlier, this is the most obvious of amounts, right? That this is really your cloud environment. And typically it's categorized into two different types of costs. Your capital expenditure, which is the cost of acquiring hardware, and operational expenditure, OpEx, which is your day-to-day, month-to-month subscription, your costs for operating your environment, and so on and so forth. And now a lot of folks kind of equate them to a private cloud or an on-prem data center, or the public cloud, your AWSs, Azure, GCPs, and so on. But we'll keep them on a very high level. So, when you're going through these, depending on your accounting practices, obviously you would need flexibility to be in both environments, in which case it's important for your workload to sit on top of a platform that'll behave the same regardless of the underlying infrastructure. So that, depending on perhaps how your financial amounts look like at any given time, you may need to move things to a more OpEx model versus at sometimes you may need to look at a CapEx model. And you want something that you can move between different environments with ease, with flexibility, and so on and so forth. So if we're talking about the pure hardware cost, CapEx is obviously relatively similar to account for, as it's relatively easy to calculate the cost of hardware and the depreciation costs. When you're going to the public cloud, there's more to take into consideration, as you probably have found out if you've gone into, again, the AWSs, Azure, or Google Cloud platforms, and that there's a lot of different things to add on top of your compute. Right? You may have your compute instances, but on top of that, there's also the storage costs. There's load balancing costs, networking, egress charges. If I have if I test out the connectivity between two different environments, that's a cost, right? And so on and so forth. So Well, each cloud provider makes it relatively easy for us to manage these aspects because, as things mature, and it's relatively mature at this point, there are reporting dashboards that they show you the different costs of your environments and your clusters. But it is still a bit more. There's more work needed to manage the costs around various environments, right? So if you actually have a hybrid cloud strategy, if you have some environments in Azure versus AWS and on-prem, being able to get a single view into all of your cost structures is more of a manual process, right? You have to import all of the reporting from the different environments, consolidate them to have a single pane of glass view. And sometimes when you have multiple availability zones and so on, it gets a lot more complex. So we want to make sure that there is a way of actually reporting them in one place so that it's going to be less cognitive load of having to switch between the different environments. Now, on top of all that, though, there's also the additional question of whether I'm actually provisioning the right amount of resources for my workload, which brings us to our second type of cost, which is configuration costs, or actually, in some cases, even misconfiguration costs. Because without a clear picture of your workloads, this is what happens, right? And often we have conversations with customers and say, "What does your environment look like?" And it's pretty big. It's usually quite large because the conversation is we go with the maximum values in the off chance that we actually need it on peak loads, because I don't want our production server to crash, right? Which then leads to over provisioning of hardware or virtual machines, right? Does the application really need your 128 eCPU, 1 terabyte RAM virtual machine with your 8 NVIDIA V100 GPUs? And, most folks will probably say, yeah, why not? It prevents my machine from dying if there's someone actually coming in. Let's say Black Friday peak loads come in. We're safe in there. But what about the other 95% of the time where you're actually underutilizing your machines? And so that phenomenon also extends to application workloads. So you have your virtual machines there, right? And then you have your clusters on top of that. And then you're deploying your workloads into your Kubernetes clusters as your pods and deployments. And without the use of the monitoring tools, you've got your auto scaling going on. As a result, everybody's requesting, say, 4 cores, 8 gigs for the deployments, and the cluster nodes run out of resources. We then deploy more VMs, and then the cost just keeps spiraling up. So it is actually quite important then to be able to monitor for historical usage of your workloads and also be able to separate them on a pod or namespace basis, not just on a node level, because the nature of Kubernetes is it's a shared resource. So many groups would be using the same cluster. And when you look at a cluster, it's really hard to tell kind of who's where if you're looking at on a machine level, because all the deployments are actually shared across the machines. That's the whole point of Kubernetes. So having the capability of looking at your cost or looking at your performance per deployment or per namespace, if that's how you're separating your groups, is going to be a very important capability to have. And the third type of cost is your opportunity costs. And this is also somewhat related to resource costs. And this is your loss of revenue due to management or downtime. And that can also be split up into two different areas. One is the actual time your development and operation teams is actually spending on revenue generating and innovation activities versus management type activities. As you can see on the screen right now, right, developers are spending less than 50% of their time coding, right? 30% is developing, there's meetings going on, there's debugging activities. And when you're doing debugging, you have to go in and look at, okay, what happened there? I have to look into logs. I have to make sure that my security is in place. And there's also other things, which leaves only about 9% of time for innovation and learning, which is probably not a good place to be, let's say, because, being a developer, I like to find out about new things. I like to play with new technologies, and I want to be able to generate meaningful code and meaningful applications to actually help my company and my group advance the functionality of our application. I mean, of course, the good news is that the development is the largest block of the individual rectangles, but you see all the other stuff is really just keeping the lights on activity. So ideally what we want is for your developing, learning, and innovation blocks to be much larger. And what we want to do is to take away from all the other stuff, right? The other stuff, the operations and security, the debugging activities. And, we still want that for developers, but we want to make it really easy for them. So it's no longer 14% of their time, but rather maybe 4% of their time, right? So that's on the development side. And on the operations side, though, the story is actually quite similar. So if you look at operations, we have these 6 top activities for operators, and you look at the complexity and effort versus value graph that we have on the axis. The majority of time is spent on really high effort but relatively low value activities such as upgrades and updates, finding faults within the system, doing maintenance activity, again, the keeping the lights on activities. And then you've got your cost management, which is, we want to make sure that it's going to be easier for folks on the operations side. Again, this is probably why you're here today, right? So ideally what we want to do is take away all of these activities so then operations folks can focus on your monitoring and innovation. So that's the first part of the opportunity cost and resource activities. The second part is more related to the actual realization of value of your code, right? So the time it takes between application creation, so ideation, code creation, all the way to deployment into production and realizing value and getting it to the hands of your end consumers, the time in between is an opportunity cost. Now, according to the Phoenix Project, which is now essentially become the DevOps Bible, the code is, until code is in production, no value is actually being generated because it's merely work in progress stuck in the system. So what we want to do is we want to be able to reduce those costs by speeding up the time between coding and deploying to production, which is essentially related to your CI/CD pipeline. And we'll talk about some of those capabilities later on as well. Now, the fourth time of costs and your typical last but not least fashion is your reputational costs. And all of that is actually related around security. Now, reputational costs can range or can be quantified anywhere from data breaches, ransomware, so ransom amounts would be your cost, your regulatory fines, perhaps if there's a data breach, that would be an additional cost. So these are quantifiable costs to unquantifiable costs, such as the loss of consumer trust, cost of customer attrition, and reputational damage. That could take perhaps quarters or even years to regain, sometimes never regained. So even the largest of us, Microsoft, Twitter, student loan, the government, is not immune to some of these costs, right? So keeping your cluster secure is a whole nother beast on its own. And you really need to know what to look for in terms of vulnerabilities and remediation. So we need a way to make it really easy for you to find within your application stack, both the application code itself, when you're doing containerization, the different layers in containers, what are the vulnerabilities within there, and how do you make sure you can patch those vulnerabilities? And also, you want to make sure that the platform you're running on is also secure, right? With things such as FIPS 140-2 encryption, or configurations such as STIG and so on and so forth, so that you don't run into these reputational costs generating events. So although it doesn't initially seem cost related, security is actually paramount in keeping your Kubernetes costs down and actually your organizational costs down. So a couple of things to consider when you're building your cost reduction strategy. First of all, your internal skills. Do we have enough skills in-house? What you want to do is you want to assess the skills that you have within your group. You truly have the resources to set up and maintain this infrastructure in a way that you can be confident about the costs and reliability moving forward. Because forget about the on-prem stuff for now. If you look at the public cloud stuff, things are changing. The cost structure is different between your cloud providers, and it's adjusting day by day depending on the new services that are being provided to you by this public cloud vendors. So having someone who's knowledgeable about everything in one public cloud provider is essential. And when you're doing hybrid cloud, then you need perhaps multiple people or one person that is very knowledgeable in all of those. And that's a pretty heavy lift for one person, right? And if the answer is no, that's perfectly fine because it is a difficult and widespread problem. You simply have to compete to bring those skilled DevOps practitioners on board, or it could be more efficient to take advantage of a DevOps as a service offering that combines outside cloud expertise and automation to give you the resource that you need as you need them. Which brings us to automation. And automation is actually key to a lot of this because, as we all know, manual work takes a lot of effort and it's error prone. There are a lot of tools and functionality that is out there, both open source and proprietary, that actually help you with a lot of your cost cutting and cost monitoring activities. And we'll talk about some of that as well in a second. You want to be able to define and implement your guardrails of your resources as well. So resource limits, who can do what, so you have a good structure of requesting resources, so that you're not getting in the way of your developers creating environments so that they could develop and deploy their code on, but rather giving them guardrails so they could play safely within those defined guardrails and perform frictionless deployments onto production environments. And last but not least, partner with your engineers. Right? Make it a two-way thing. Right? It's not something that should come solely from top to bottom. I mean, work with your engineers to find out how you could help them monitor their workloads. Right? Partner with them with the cost savings. Maybe perhaps the cost savings could go back into the individual groups in the form of innovation bonuses, or depending on how accurate each group estimates their workloads, with the tools that you'll be providing them, make it into like a competition. I mean, I've seen some groups that actually do something like that, right? So each individual groups have their say, okay, make it almost like a gamified event where, all right, my next workload is going to be X amount, and when I actually do deploy it, the closest group gets a bonus or gets a gift, a movie ticket, whatever. That has happened for customers as well. So that could be a good way to encourage innovation within the engineers as well and make them feel more inclusive. What I'd like to introduce to you then, in order to provide some of the capabilities of implementing this strategy, really is Lens Autopilot. Now, Lens Autopilot is a culmination of a decade of serving thousands of customers in virtualization, DevOps, and containers. We've clearly established that Kubernetes alone is not enough for most teams. There's other components to be needed to plan, set up, configured, and also monitor to provide cost-effective operations of your clusters and your application workloads. So our objective really is to remove the complexity involved in container technologies in Kubernetes. We want to maximize developer activity and productivity and handle all of the operational costs and tasks that distract developers. And that's what we term ZeroOps. With ZeroOps for modern applications, your team doesn't need to spend time operating Kubernetes themselves. Instead, they could focus on delivering code and creating applications. So with Lens Autopilot, what we do is we take away a lot of the management activities that is taking away your operations folks' time. Right? We're taking away some of that debugging activity of your developers, giving them the information that they need to actually fix code, deploy code, remediate, and go on to their next tasks. Okay? So Lens Autopilot is 100% Kubernetes and infrastructure agnostic. It is a platform for cloud-native applications and infrastructure. But behind the scenes, Lens Autopilot runs around our Lens IDE, our Kubernetes Lens IDE. And it's a group of fully managed services that is delivered through the Lens IDE along with extensions. So to put it succinctly, Lens Autopilot will get you set up with all of the necessary DevOps tools, processes, education, and confidence to begin or continue on your cloud-native journey in the quickest manner possible without compromising on the critical aspects of security, governance, automation, and measurable outcomes through metrics. As you can see over here, some of the key components here, we got security audits to make sure there are no issues of your environments and your application workloads. We have capacity and cost analysis. We have your application health, so the operations don't have to worry about keeping the lights on. We'll keep the lights on for you, where your operations folks can then focus on managing and innovating on technology. We have security in RBAC. We have guardrails through policy enforcer. Experts in 24/7 support, training to help your folks come up to speed, and give them the tool sets and the knowledge they need to be able to deploy and run their own environment. And also CI/CD and GitOps out of the box, so that code can be deployed quickly into your environments through your testing stages and into production. Now, so when we look at this, we looked at all the different costs earlier, but how do we manage them? Right. So a quote by Lord Kelvin was the gentleman that gave us the Kelvin scale in temperature. If you can't measure it, you can't improve it. Of course, that's not the full quote. I'll show you what the full quote is later on. But the important thing is, in order to improve something, we actually need to measure it. And this is where the reporting and cost structure management comes into play. How do we manage the performance of our workloads easily within multiple environments and multiple clusters in one single area? How do we easily see the different costs of our workloads within the different clusters by different groups, by different namespace or pods, or how much CPU is it taking? What does it actually cost me in terms of public and private clouds? And according to the FinOps for Kubernetes report, the vast majority of respondents fell into one or two different camps. Either they do or don't monitor Kubernetes spend, so they don't monitor Kubernetes spend at all, this is 24%, or they rely on monthly estimates, which is 44%. And the good news is Lens Autopilot actually provides plenty of tools to provide comprehensive and actionable Kubernetes cost monitoring. So in terms of performance, Lens, the Kubernetes IDE, actually gives you built-in dashboards and Prometheus hooks to give you your CPU usage, your memory, and also usage by pods on a timescale level. So you see over here, I'm actually quite underutilized in my clusters. And you can break that down into also your master and worker nodes within your clusters. Now, on top of that, through extensions and partnership through Kubecost, we could actually look at by namespace, what is my spend per CPU, my RAM, GPU, and so on individually. So this way you could actually monitor your costs in one single pane of your different clusters that you see over here. I've got multiple clusters set up, and I could look at for each individual group how much costs is being incurred by the workloads. Now, of course, if you want a more thorough breakdown of your costs, you could then also go into the Kubecost or OpenCost dashboard to look at an overview of your Kubernetes costs, your total costs, and break down by your cluster trends. Perhaps you go in and look at it in terms of your different namespaces, right? Within your cluster one, this is how much our monitor is costing me per month. Kube system, our workload, default workload, and so on and so forth. And you could see what the trends are day by day and month by month as well. So you could better manage your costs all in one place. For optimization, there are also suggestions to look at, what are the best ways to reduce some of your Kubernetes costs. As you can see over here, I'm pretty over-provisioned in my clusters and underutilized. So there are plenty of savings to be had, and these are all built into Lens Autopilot. Now, also on the topic of security. Now, how do we ensure our clusters are secure? Now, within Lens, we do have the security center on an images level, a resource level, and also on a roles level to look at our configuration within our images. What sort of vulnerabilities do I have within our individual images? And this, by the way, are live images that are being deployed into my clusters. So over here, you see I do have a number of vulnerabilities and failures that I have to look out for. There are some high-level vulnerabilities, and each individual one, if I click on those, actually brings me to a CVE database to inform me of what type of vulnerability this is and how to remediate it as well. And if there's any exposed secrets, and that's the last thing we want because that's what really puts you on the news, we want to make sure we patch all those holes. And this gives you a very simple view into all of your clusters on what your security risks are. So, what Lens Autopilot and ZeroOps actually does is it fixes the mix of activities of your group and what we could do for you. So, what you want to do is you want to focus on the high level activities, giving more power to your developers and operations to revenue generation activities, to really focus on your business and increase your application velocity, and leave us to the engineering services, the operations, the lights on activities that actually just ensures that your group can actually provide value to your end customers. And with heightened security, with business protection, secure systems, data environments, and eliminated risk. So the value that Lens Autopilot delivers, and we've seen a 5x to 10x increase in application deployment speed. There's a whopping 75% of reduction of vulnerabilities and security incidents. There's accelerated time to remediation because you know exactly what's going on, or we'll provide logs as well of what the issues are with any downtime events, any environment events. And key to today's topic, a 2x to 4x reduction in operational costs. So that really eliminates the complexity of Kubernetes and cloud native app development and eliminating risk, acting and operating like a service provider, and really allows you to meet the demands of your customers and outpace the competitors, which is key to any business. So with ZeroOps and Lens Autopilot, you do the apps and we do the ops. So this way you can focus on the value generating activities of innovation and creation and see the results that you want. So to find out more, please visit Mirantis.com or the QR code on the screen that'll bring you straight to the website. And as promised, here's the actual Lord Kelvin quote. And you see it's a lot more verbose than what was shown on screen before, but that's, you always like sound bites. So it's pretty distilled into, if it's not measured, it can't be improved. All right, so I don't see any questions from the audience. It was a pleasure presenting that information to you. And I wish you all a wonderful rest of your day, or this late in the evening for you. Thank you very much and good night.